Welcome to the continuation of this lecture for U.S. History 1. Today we are going to continue our road to the Civil War. As always, there are some key terms that you should be able to keep track of as you go through this lecture, and one question that you should be able to answer at the end. Let's get to it. We spent class time discussing the growing problem that slavery played in the first half of the 1850s. That problem is only going to get worse. The years 1856 to 1860 will be turbulent ones for the Union, and ultimately they will lead to civil war. Dred Scott and the Lecompton Constitution are two of the biggest issues that will arise during this period. Combined, these two issues will be enough to rip apart the last of the two national political parties. The result ultimately will be secession and civil war. But before we jump into that, let's review a few more of the issues that will increase tensions between North and South in the last few years of the 1850s. Let's begin by returning to an old friend. We simply cannot go any farther without discussing John Brown. We've met Brown before. Brown escaped prosecution following the Potawatomi Massacre in Kansas, and now he's about to put into motion his next blow against slavery. Brown gathered a small group of followers around him and traveled east to Harper's Ferry, Virginia, the site of a federal arsenal. What was his plan? Well, the plan was to seize the arsenal and take all of the weapons. Then they were going to escape into the countryside and arm the slaves. This, they believed, would lead to a slave uprising, and ultimately, slavery would be destroyed. His plan failed miserably, and shortly after his attack began, he was captured. Ultimately, he was put on trial and convicted of treason and sentenced to die. But before he was hanged, he made a speech. It was a speech that would continue to illustrate the split between North and South. Here is a short excerpt from that speech. "If it is deemed necessary that I should forfeit my life for the furtherance of the ends of justice, and mingle my blood further with the blood of millions in this slave country, whose rights are disregarded by wicked, cruel, and unjust enactments, I say let it be done." End quote. Now, Northerners and Southerners saw Brown very differently. Northerners saw him as a martyr to the cause of freedom. Southerners, on the other hand, saw him as a dangerous madman who had nearly plotted a slave rebellion that would kill who knows how many of them. And now it's time for yet another presidential election. During the last election in 1856, it had been the Democrats that had been the only unified national political party. They rode that unity to victory in 1856. Now that's not going to be the case in 1860. 4 years after Buchanan's election, the Democrats were split into factions. What was the issue that drove them apart? You guessed it, slavery. And now it was time for another presidential election. The election of 1860 will demonstrate that there is no longer a unified Democratic Party to hold the nation together. Northern Democrats will support Stephen Douglas, the senator from Illinois who was the brains behind the Kansas-Nebraska Act. In 1860, he still trumpeted the issue of popular sovereignty as the best solution to the issue of slavery in the Western territories. But by 1860, popular sovereignty was no longer enough. The Dred Scott decision led some Southerners to argue that there should be no limits on the expansion of slavery to the West. These Democrats were led by John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky, who argued there should be no limits on slavery anywhere. Of course, some still argued that the best course was to not talk about slavery at all. The neutral position was held by John Bell of Missouri. Bell said as little about slavery as possible, and in this way he was very traditional, arguing that the Union was more important than the slavery issue. The Republicans, of course, will nominate Abraham Lincoln, a relatively unknown lawyer from Illinois. Like Fremont in 1856, Lincoln tried to make it clear that he would not end the institution of slavery in the South. He would, however, no longer allow slavery to expand to the Western territories. When the results were tallied, Lincoln won. The Southern vote was split among Breckinridge, Bell, and Douglas. Yet even if you added the electoral votes won by Douglas, Bell, and Breckinridge, they still did not number the majority garnered by Abraham Lincoln. Southerners believed that this was an ominous result. They believed that this election demonstrated to them that the days of slavery were numbered. Even though Lincoln promised not to touch slavery in the South, many Southerners did not believe him. Moreover, they argued that the North's greater population growth was going to allow it to dominate the U.S. government from now on. Moreover, remember the mentality of Southerners at this point. The Dred Scott decision had led them to believe that slavery could be carried into any territory in the nation. Now, the concern was that any limits on slavery, even those proposed by Abraham Lincoln, were simply unacceptable. And once Southerners reached that conclusion, they decided that it was time to go. On December 20th, 1860, South Carolina voted for secession. Over the next 3 months, 6 more states will join them: Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas, and Florida. The nation is teetering on the brink of collapse.